The day after Tim got recognized by a rich family, his fake brother made him sign a strange bet. The deal said if the fake brother could take away Tim's stuff 9 times, Tim had to leave on his own. Tim agreed. On the 9th attempt, the fake brother set his sights on Tim's girlfriend, who was struggling financially. He threw down $2 million, asking Emily to marry him. Marry you? Sure. Tim looked up in disbelief. But then Emily, touching her card with her long fingers, gave him a reassuring smile when their eyes met. But the person I'm marrying is Tim. I might be broke, but I got pride. I'll only bow to the man I love most. That day, the fake brother ran out crying and, out of anger, agreed to marry Rose for some good luck. Emily wasn't fazed, just watched him go nuts with a cold stare. Later that night, Tim, holding a newly made ring, overheard the servants calling his poor girlfriend a young lady. Are you really gonna watch Gary marry someone else? The Booths are no joke. Once the wedding's over, it's too late. Emily's usually soft face showed a coldness Tim had never seen. I underestimated him, thought marrying his brother would pressure him to comply, but didn't expect him to be so stubborn. Fine, the wedding will go on, but before that, tie Tim up and deliver him to the Booths. This matter, including my identity, must remain a secret. I need to take this opportunity to teach Gary a lesson. At that moment, Tim felt like he'd fallen into an ice pit. The ring fell to the floor with a crisp sound. He messaged his sister. I've agreed to stand in for Gary in the marriage for good luck. I've thought it over, won't change my mind. I'll do it. Tim opened his sister Daisy's office door. His expression was hidden in shadows, making his mocking eyes hard to read. Daisy was playing a game, but she quickly dropped her phone when hearing him. You agreed? Awesome. The Booths were just urging us. The young lady's condition is worsening. She might only have 2 weeks left, and they want us married before then. I'll get the bridal price ready for you right now. Pick out any car brand you like. My garage is yours. Whatever. Tim cut her off. I don't really care about those. But if you remember I'm your real brother, then you'll agree to 2 conditions. The air froze. Daisy turned away, avoiding his eyes. What conditions? First, give me 2 villas. Second, keep my marriage for good luck a secret from everyone, especially Gary and Emily. Daisy's face froze, then looked at him like he was insane. You're asking for the moon here, and you're the one who insisted on pursuing Emily, which ticked off Gary enough to volunteer marrying into the Booths and scared him half to death. All your fault. I thought you were stepping up by offering to go, but you're still nasty, making him scared again. That's on him. Tim shouted, more animated than he'd ever been since joining the Whites. Was I the one who forced him into that deal? You feel sorry for him after just a few days of fear, but don't care I'm marrying someone who's dying? If Gary's the only brother you care about, why'd you bring me back from the orphanage? Why not send me back to where I came from? He took a deep breath, finishing in one go, plus those 2 houses are assets Mom and Dad left for me when I was born. I'm just taking back what's mine. So who are you to call me greedy? A barrage of questions left Daisy speechless, veins standing out on her forehead. After staring at Tim for a while, she couldn't see him budge an inch, so she grit her teeth. Fine, I won't argue. The marriage is set in stone. I transferred the houses to Gary's name, but I'll make the change for you. Tim offered a cold laugh and turned to leave. Just as the door was closing, Daisy asked one last question. Let's say the villas are yours. Fair play. But why keep it from Emily? Isn't she all over you, willing to do anything for you? With your wedding around the corner, how am I supposed to explain this to Emily? No need to explain, Tim stated, colder than ever. Daisy finally realized the orphanage-raised boy wasn't as easygoing as he seemed. Outside, Tim's eyes welled up. He looked at the newly hung wallpaper and their wedding photos, and his heart felt like it was being ripped apart. His phone rang, Emily checking in as always. Tim was about to respond when he heard a breathy sound from her end. He paused, steadied himself to keep his voice from shaking. What are you up to? Thinking about you, she teased. Since you're not around, had to find some fun on my own. Tim pulled up the system to see the surveillance footage on Emily. She was flirting with him on the phone while giving Gary a wicked smile in person. Each sweet word to Tim made Gary furious. When Gary finally couldn't resist reaching to kiss her, Emily dodged, knocking over a vase. Its shattering sounded through Tim's phone. Satisfied, Emily tossed her phone aside, unaware that Tim could see everything. She teased Gary, "Mad already? Tell me you love me, and I won't marry your brother." Tim didn't bother watching the rest. He cut the connection, tears slipping down his cheeks. Why hide his marriage for good luck from Emily? To the world, they seemed madly in love. But only Tim knew every bit of Emily's affection was to corner the Whites' young master, Gary. She'd lied to him, and now he'd deceive her once. "System, I'm done trying with Emily." Tim dried his tears, calling the system. This time, the usual mechanical response hesitated. "Host, if you end the bond, not only will she revert to her old self, but you'll also take a big hit." "Doesn't matter." Tim's tone was unwavering. "As long as I survive, I'll pay any price to leave Emily." "Hold on, host, let me think of something." Tim first met Emily when they both were at their lowest. When Tim first joined the Whites, life was easy for a while. His parents felt guilty he'd been kidnapped by a maid and ended up in an orphanage, so they tried to make it up to him, even if they weren't close. But Tim could feel it. His family preferred Gary, the boy they'd raised. Gary had the biggest, brightest room. Gary had mild OCD, so Tim couldn't bunk on his floor. Gary claimed Tim smelled weird. It made him uncomfortable. Tim never thought about competing with him. That was until Gary made a bet. He said he could take away the most important things from Tim 9 times. If he succeeded, Tim had to leave the Whites on his own. If he failed, it would be his loss of face. Tim agreed. He wanted to see if his blood family truly didn't care about him. The first time, Gary took away his admission to an international high school, even though Tim had worked hard for it. The second time, Gary took his dog that he'd had for 3 years. Within 3 months, he returned a lifeless body to Tim. The third time, Gary snatched the first person Tim had a crush on. She publicly humiliated Tim, saying he was nothing but a hillbilly compared to Gary. But within a week, Gary dumped her. Time and time again, whatever Tim cared about, Gary easily took away. Even scarier, Tim realized that his family's attitude toward him was getting colder. His dad lectured him, "You're the older brother. You should give in to your little brother." His mom pulled him aside to the study. "Gary isn't our biological child. He's very insecure. Don't keep confronting him." His sister was blunt, locking Tim in the school warehouse overnight. "Just because you're my biological brother doesn't mean you can take away what belongs to Gary." Tim always wanted to defend himself, but Gary's tears could easily capture the family's attention. By the 9th time, when Gary announced he would take away Tim's marriage partner, Tim had already given up. He packed his bags, just waiting for the bet to end so he could leave the Whites. Then he found Emily in an alley. She was lying in the rain, her abdomen riddled with wounds, her blood almost staining Tim's shoes. He wanted to run, but she reached for his ankle. He couldn't risk taking someone like her to a real hospital. That's when Tim heard the system voice. It said if he could win over Emily, not only would her wounds be healed, but he could also have 3 wishes granted. With that power, Emily survived. Her severely injured legs showed no signs of damage. She became someone Tim couldn't let go of. So, Emily replaced the fiancé and became Gary's new target. Their 9th bet. When he confronted Gary, his sister was behind him, silently threatening Tim to give up. But in the silence, Emily took his hand. "The person I love is only Tim. The one worth marrying is only Tim." At that moment, tears streamed down Tim's face. He finally won once. However, after Gary agreed to go to the booths for the wedding, the last of Tim's dreams was shattered. He overheard Emily casually instructing her subordinates. "When the booths come to pick me up, tie Tim up and send him along too. But keep my identity secret. When Gary and I are united, I'll reveal it myself." A subordinate asked, "What about Tim? You agreed to marry for his sake. Won't you leave him to fend for himself with the booths?" She paused. "He is obedient and understanding. I promise to treat him better. Once the booths aren't watching him, Get him out and lock him in my villa on the north side. If he escapes, I'll break your legs." It turned out the person he saved was the mysterious Ms. Miller from the underworld, an influential figure the whites couldn't offend. He realized even at the booths he couldn't escape this nightmare. Tim couldn't stand being tied to someone like that through the system any longer. As his heart turned cold, the system voice surprisingly held a hint of excitement. "Host, I've detected a better target. Rose, the daughter of the booths, was nearly killed during a mission. She's currently brain dead. I can heal her, and if you win her over, you can have 3 wishes granted. What do you say? Want to take a chance?" Tim's heart skipped a beat. In the system's long speech, the word sacrifice stood out. He didn't hesitate long. Switch targets. Reviving her might be more worthwhile than saving Emily. The system went to its superiors to report and switch the target. The weight on Tim's mind eased slightly. When he got home, he ran into Gary storming out, eyes red. Gary shoved Tim hard. "Move." Tim's back hit the table corner and Emily caught him. Her face turned dark as she stopped Gary. "Apologize." Gary stared in disbelief. "Who does he think he is? Why should I apologize to him?" "Emily, don't push it." Emily lifted Tim's shirt, revealing a nasty bruise on his lower back. Her expression grew even darker. She warned, "Don't make me do something worse." The boy shivered, tears silently falling, like a poor little rabbit. Tim once hoped someone in this house would stand up for him. But now that it happened, it felt so ridiculous. How should he punish? Emily's scent was the same as Gary's body wash. Tim was really tired. People who didn't sincerely care for him were worthless to keep around. He stepped away from Emily's support. "I'm fine. We've got a family dinner tonight. I'll go change." Emily couldn't hide her surprise. "You don't want him to apologize?" Once she could see it clearly. In front of Gary, when she defended him, there was a sparkle in the boy's eyes. But this time it was like an old well, no ripple at all. Emily felt a bit uneasy, so she quickly spoke up. "Can I go with you tonight?" Tim gave her a surprised glance, but seeing the hope in her eyes, he quickly understood. "If you want to come, then come. Emily doesn't like crowded places. But if she doesn't go to the family dinner, she'll be separated from Gary, which is probably a kind of torment for her. Luckily, in half a month, he'll be marrying Rose, the comatose girl. By then, without him around being a hindrance, Emily can stick to Gary as long as she wants." That evening, the car drove into the Whites' ancestral home. This is the first time Emily, a poor woman, attended such a formal banquet. Tim didn't wait for her. A trace of dissatisfaction flashed across her face, but she quickly put on an appropriate smile and followed behind Tim, attracting envious glances. Despite Tim not being particularly capable, the girlfriend he found is top-notch in looks and figure. Plus, with such a strong wife, he won't be looked down upon after marriage. Tim showed no reaction, but Gary was quite upset, throwing himself into his grandma's arms, acting spoiled. The old lady comforted him. Poor Gary, having to suffer at the booths, blaming someone for being ungrateful, insisting on competing with our precious for a woman. If you got engaged earlier, it wouldn't have come to this. Tim had a cold smile on his lips. It seemed like all the Whites people thought it didn't matter if he went to the booths. For Gary, the booths might be a den of suffering. But for him, Tim, is it heaven? That night, in front of everyone, the old lady handed the jade bracelet on her left hand to Gary. "This is the Whites' heirloom. We only pass it down to one person each generation. Gary, it's yours." "No." In the silence, a woman's calm voice rang out. Tim was startled and looked at the speaker. Emily leaned against the back of her chair, projecting a nobility that didn't match her identity. Smiling slightly, eyes sharply fixed on Gary. "Isn't Tim the real son of the Whites? Gary is just adopted. How can he get that bracelet?" The atmosphere around the dinner table paused, various looks turning to Tim, making him uncomfortable. He quickly tugged on Emily's clothes, whispering, "I don't care. You don't have to do this." The woman flashed him a smile, then continued to give Gary a look apparently intended to put pressure on him. "If you beg me, I'll make sure your brother doesn't hold it against you." Tim felt a chill in his heart. Emily wasn't trying to stand up for him. She was clearly using his name to force Gary to yield to her, not caring about Tim's well-being. The old lady banged her cane on the ground several times in anger. Well, Tim, you have some nerve. Having a girlfriend means you let your woman insult your own brother. Have you been hiding these thoughts for a long time? I'm telling you, you keep making things difficult for Gary, and I'll kick you out of the family. Tim lowered his eyes. Then, the system's voice chimed in, "Host, the target has been changed. The new target will take effect in 2 weeks. In other words, from then on, the Whites and Emily wouldn't be able to bind him anymore." Years of grievance surged. Tim suddenly raised his head. "Gary, want to bet with me again?" Gary heard bet and, for a moment, his expression was unnatural. "Bet what?" "Bet on this bracelet. We'll bid turn by turn, only using our own things as stakes. Whoever bids higher takes the bracelet and the other side stakes." Unexpected surprise flashed across everyone's faces because they all knew Tim grew up in an orphanage, found but not favored. What did he have to wager against Gary? Obviously, Gary thought so too. He was the first to pull out a black card. "Don't chicken out. This is my entire savings." Tim chuckled, pulling out a similar card. The butler checked the balance, looking perplexed. "Master Tim wins." "Impossible," Gary muttered in disbelief, taking out a string of keys. A private island from Dad, a villa from Mom, and a yacht from Sister. These should be enough. They were his birthday presents from past years. Tim produced some documents. The butler's attitude turned serious. "Master Tim wins." At this point, people around were curious, wanting to see what the documents contained. Tim remained unfazed. "Continue? Everything you have is actually gifted by Mom and Dad. I refuse to believe you have anything else. I can tell you what I have are my scholarships and patent papers, all earned on my own, and I can provide even more if needed." Gary's face flushed with disbelief, chest rising and falling sharply before he declared, "Continue. A 16 million villa. I don't believe you can scrape that amount together quickly." Daisy's face blanched, immediately trying to stop him. "Gary, don't. Why not? This is all I have left." "Sister, do you want to see me lose?" "No, it's just..." Before she finished, the butler interjected. "Sorry, Master Gary, these 2 properties now belong to Master Tim." "What?" Gary's expression turned to shock, as if someone had gripped his throat. 16 billion suddenly became Tim's chips. If Gary couldn't put up something more valuable, everything he had would become Tim's. Gary, anxious, twisted his sleeves, with his grandma and sister watching worriedly but helplessly. They couldn't bring themselves to help Gary cheat openly. As he bit his lower lip, on the verge of tears, Tim stayed calm, staring at him. In the past, Tim wouldn't have been so aggressive. He always wanted to fit in with the Whites and wouldn't want to embarrass their young master. But today, no matter who tried to reason with him, Tim wouldn't change his mind. Someone was already preparing to take the bracelet that was up as a bet. Gary started crying loudly. Just then, the butler looked in disbelief at his computer. 5 billion. Someone had just transferred 5 billion to Gary's account. Oh my God! 5 billion, who could instantly transfer that much cash? The guests at the family gathering gasped in surprise. The butler wiped the cold sweat off his forehead, answered a call, and put it on speaker. A voice Tim recognized came through the phone. "Ms. Miller says Gary can't lose. The Millers will cover all of Gary's bets today." Every word was clear, hitting the hearts of everyone present. The Millers. Is it the Millers I'm thinking of? Who else has that kind of money? This is no comparison to Tim's girlfriend. These are the real big shots. Tim, you might as well give it up. The Millers have tons of money and hold grudges. If you piss them off, life won't be easy. Tim's ears buzzed, and he stared intently at Emily. The woman was still smiling, as if none of this concerned her, watching Gary laugh through his tears, like she was watching her prey. Tim just felt it was all absurd. He put up the 2 houses, 6 billion, I'm following. Less than 5 minutes later, another 200 million came through. The Millers had the capability to shut Tim down instantly, but they chose to torment him with just a slight edge. Tim finally broke down. With a hoarse voice, he confronted Emily. "So, you're not leaving me any way out today?" The woman seemed to snap back, realizing she was Tim's fiancée. She apologetically hugged Tim's shoulder. "Sorry, Tim. I'm just an ordinary person. I can't help you out here. But, since this situation started because of me, I'll talk to Gary and cancel the bet." Tim was shaking with emotion. No ability? The person who caused this mess was the woman right in front of him. Whether as his fiancée or as the mysterious Ms. Miller, she intended to crush his dignity. Tim struggled to stand his ground. "I won't admit defeat. It's just a bet. I'll keep going." Emily frowned and held his arm. "Tim, don't do anything rash. There's no point losing everything over this, right?" Tim squeezed his eyes shut. The Booth's dowry was already in his hands. If he risked it all, even Emily couldn't fight him. Doing so would expose the arranged marriage, but under no circumstances could he lose this bet. Before he could speak, his grandma intervened. She looked at Tim with a complex expression and scolded Gary. "All right, Gary, stop fooling around. Emily has a point. Giving you the bracelet unilaterally isn't fair to Tim. I'll hold on to the bracelet. Since the bet is off, the deal is void. It was just a joke between brothers. Everyone takes their stuff back." Emily raised an eyebrow. Tim saw a hint of disappointment in her eyes. He broke free from the woman's grip, his nails digging into his palms. Beyond the shame, he was full of regret. He should have never agreed to bind to any system. Letting Emily die in that alley would have been better for everyone. After the gathering, Tim refused Emily's company and walked back alone. He didn't want to see anyone's sympathetic or mocking looks. When he reached the riverside, the system spoke up. "Host, Emily and Gary are across the river." "Is that so? What are they talking about?" The system helpfully eavesdropped. Emily softly asked Gary, "Any regrets about breaking up with me?" "Doesn't matter if I do or don't." Gary's voice was cold. "You're about to marry Tim, and I have to marry the Booth's deceased daughter. We have no future." Emily's voice turned a bit coaxing. "Just say you were wrong. I can sort these things out." Gary sneered. "You're just an ordinary person, as if your word means anything. You're not actually pretending to be Ms. Miller, are you? If it weren't for her tonight, I'd have been extremely embarrassed, you know? Emily, this was all you're doing, and I despise you." Tim stayed silent. Emily had solved the issue, yet she wouldn't tell Gary. She still pretended to be sincerely in love, favoring Tim's despised brother in front of him. All of it was just to make Gary apologize, to humble himself. And he deserved to become Emily and Gary's pawn. Suddenly, Tim didn't want Emily to reveal herself. He took out his phone and dialed. "Emily, I want to taste the porridge you cooked yourself. Where are you?" Emily sounded a bit resigned. "I'm almost home. I'll go buy the ingredients now. Do you want chicken porridge or seafood porridge?" Gary was a bit irritated by her sweetness. His little face flushed. Tim had good eyesight and clearly saw a figure turn and run away. He casually replied to achieve his purpose, "You decide." A woman's doting voice came through. "All right, you just wait to eat." Tim went in first. After just a few sips of porridge, Emily called out, "Gary, your brother has no appetite tonight. I made porridge for him. Do you want some?" Gary got closer and suddenly knocked over the bowl. Scalding porridge splashed on Tim's wrist, leaving a red burn. "I'm allergic to seafood, what's the deal?" Emily's lips were smiling, but her eyes were full of malicious provocation. "My husband loves seafood porridge, so I make seafood porridge. Why should I consider you? Who are you to me?" Tim tossed the spoon onto the table, making a crisp noise. In a cold voice, he said, "I don't have time to deal with your issues, but the porridge on me, you can either wipe it clean or lick it clean." "Emily, I found you. Remember who you are." Emily's pupils shrank. Gary looked disdainful. "Big attitude, talking to me like that. Be careful, I'll tell sister and get you kicked out." Tim raised an eyebrow, a chill in his eyes. "Go ahead. Let's see if she'll speak a word." Now, the Whites are the ones who can't be without Tim. If he leaves, where will the Whites find another son to bring Gary luck? Having shut Gary up, Tim turned to Emily. "You seem to enjoy bickering with Gary. How about this? I'll decide and let you marry Gary as a concubine. Follow him to the booths. Are you okay with that? Emily forced a laugh. Stop joking. Why say it like that? That's because I'm being kind. Tim coldly interrupted. You eat, live, and your life is because of me. How can you say no? He stood up to leave. Suddenly, a system warning sounded. Host, be careful. The large crystal chandelier above crashed down fast. Everything happened so quickly. Tim, used to hardships from a young age, reacted by covering his head with both arms and ran outside at the system's warning. But he never expected that Emily would push him slightly, pulling Gary from the danger zone. The chandelier crashed heavily to the ground, shards cutting many wounds into Tim. He was in such pain he almost fainted, staring stubbornly at his fiancée and brother. Before losing consciousness, he saw Emily rushing to him, ice-cold hands pressing on his arm wound. It was the last straw. When he regained consciousness, he smelled antiseptic. Tim gritted his teeth hard, anger bubbling inside with no outlet. Before he opened his eyes, he heard Gary crying at the bedside. Emily, you still love me, don't you? Otherwise, you wouldn't have saved me. If it's true, take me away. Let's run away from marriage. Mom, Dad, and Sis would have Tim go over to satisfy the booths, and then we can come back after it's all settled. Gary? Even without looking, Tim could guess that beneath the woman's gentle gaze was satisfaction. She was finally succeeding. She had captured Gary's heart. Before she could keep talking, Tim struggled to wake up, yanking the drip off his right arm. Hearing the noise, Emily turned around quickly, looking anxious. Tim, are you awake? How are you feeling? Tim slapped her across the face. The blow turned Emily's head to the side. Her pupils trembled uncontrollably. Are you insane? Since becoming Ms. Miller officially, nobody dared treat her this way. Slapping someone was worse than stabbing them. Tim didn't hesitate. Another slap landed. Emily, whose fiancé are you? Doesn't your conscience tell you? Shoving aside your lover to protect another man is wrong. Tim, let me explain. Tim's hand shook from the force. Droplets of blood splattered from his hand. He ignored it, reaching for the nurse call button. We're done. Gary rushed forward, grabbing his hand. Don't do it. I know you're jealous. You can't stand anyone being nice to me. You can't treat Emily like that. Even if she's gonna marry you, she's still your wife. How can you not give her any respect? A spark of excitement flashed in Gary's eyes as he grabbed Tim's hand and slapped it against his own face. Hit me, take it out on me. Just don't take it out on Emily after you hit me. Tim could have easily pulled away, but seeing Emily reach out to help Gary up made him bite his lip and go along with it. He slapped Gary, following his lead. The man let out a scream, and his cheek immediately swelled up. Emily kept a tense face, but surprisingly, she smiled instead of getting angry. Tim, it's my fault. In the heat of the moment, you and Gary looked so alike. I mistook you for him. I swear it won't happen again. But that day, when the three of them left the hospital in a car, it suddenly turned into a small alley. A dozen bikes surrounded the car. A guy in a black suit, holding an iron rod, yanked the car door open. They didn't even look at him, just dragged him out of the car. Ms. Miller wants me to teach you a lesson. Either let us slap you 100 times, or I'll break your wife's leg. Some women pretended to hold Emily down. She yelled angrily, "Come at me, don't hurt him." Tim felt desolate inside, like a barren land hiding erupting lava beneath. He almost laughed out loud. Go ahead. Break her leg then. Everyone froze. Gary was the first to scream. How could you be so cruel? It's only 100 slaps. You won't die from that. If Emily's leg breaks, who's gonna fix it? Right, what would someone do without a leg? Tim's gaze landed on Emily's leg. I wonder if Ms. Miller's leg has ever been broken. Does she know what it's like to not have one? Emily's struggling stopped. Silence filled the alley. Not even the sound of insects, just the sharp sound of slaps. Emily never stopped it. The system in Tim's mind urged him, host, don't panic. The police have been called and will be here in 5 minutes. Tim had never hated anyone so much. He was biting the skin off his lip, leaving it a bloody mess. All he did was slap Gary once, and that was only because Gary asked for it. And Emily wanted 100 slaps in return, putting on an act for him, pretending she'd do anything for him. He swore he'd pay back this pain eventually. After 50 slaps, Tim's face was swollen and raw. His skin was so fragile it bled easily, making it hard to continue hitting. He heard those people asking for permission. "Ms. Miller, should we keep going?" But the woman just looked at him for a moment and made a discreet hand gesture. That meant to continue. Tim shut his eyes tight. The slap was poised to come down, but paused indefinitely. Then he heard a loud shout. "What are you doing? Is there any law and order left?" He looked up to see a car blocking the alley's entrance. Not the police. After being taken to the hospital, Emily was not allowed to visit Tim. A dignified man sat by his bed. "You're Tim, right? Don't be afraid. I'm Rose's father." Tim was a bit surprised. Mr. Booth's face was calm, but worry lingered in his eyes, showing how much he cared for his daughter's situation. He held Tim's hand. "The wedding to drive away bad luck is just a show for Rose's grandmother. The old lady is getting senile, couldn't handle her granddaughter's sacrifice, and started praying everywhere. Eventually, someone convinced her that finding a man to marry Rose would bring good luck. Once the wedding ceremony is done, I can send you abroad. You're young. Do you want to keep studying?" Tim softly shook his head and gripped the man's hand in return. "Don't give up too soon. There might be a way to heal Rose's injury." When he got home from the hospital, boxes of gifts filled the Whites' old house living room. Gary grinned brightly. "These are all from Ms. Miller. She proposed to me already. Once the Booth's useless one kicks the bucket, I'll marry Ms. Miller. You're invited to my wedding." He sighed. "It's crazy how people can be so different. You've just got one girlfriend, and your family has to pitch in to help you guys. So pitiful." Tim was curious. "Weren't you just calling her Emily and hanging on to her at every chance? You guys seemed pretty close. You're not mad she wants to marry me?" Gary shrugged it off. "Just another scholarship kid. I can find plenty in college. None compare to Ms. Miller. It's not just money that reaches the Miller's level." Tim almost laughed, wondering what Emily would think hearing this. He asked in his mind, "Did you get that recorded?" The words played back in his mind. "Don't worry, host." Tim visited the director who took care of him at the orphanage. The kind old man had a big smile on his face. "Tim, I heard you're getting married. I don't have much to give you, but take this amulet. I hope you'll always be safe and happy. By the way, how's your fiancée? Is she good to you?" Tim felt a lump in his throat and managed a genuine smile. "I haven't met her, but she's a good person. She's a soldier willing to sacrifice for the country. Even if she doesn't love me, I trust she won't treat me badly." "What do you mean, doesn't love?" Emily's voice came from behind him. She studied Tim's expression, then handed a fruit basket to the director. "Don't worry, I am Tim's fiancée. After we get married, I'll treat him well." The director looked a bit confused. But Tim said. He glanced at Tim's numbed expression and sighed, saying nothing more. Emily and Tim walked out of the orphanage side by side. She handed him a bottle of pills. "You've been saying your stomach has been bothering you. I got a friend to get you some medicine. Remember to take 2 pills before bed." Tim clutched the bottle. The label said it was regular stomach medicine, but his system warned him it contains sedatives. 30 minutes after taking 2 pills, you'll be out cold. Emily had prepared for both scenarios. If Tim took the sleeping pills, he'd unknowingly be sent to the Booths. If he didn't, Ms. Miller's people would bind him and send him forcefully. Tim wanted to laugh. She didn't know all her efforts were in vain. Back home, Daisy rushed over. "Bad news. Someone from the Booths said their eldest daughter went into the ICU last night. The doctors can only maintain her vitals. She could die any time. They want us to send someone over tomorrow morning." Before Tim could speak, Emily exclaimed, "So soon." She clutched Tim's hand tightly, for once actually seeming reluctant. Gary turned pale, collapsed onto the couch, and grabbed onto Daisy's sleeve. "I'm scared. What if Rose dies as soon as I get there? I'll have to spend the night with a dead person?" Daisy hugged him tightly, comforting. "No, don't worry. How could your sister let you go through that? As she spoke, she looked at Tim, but didn't see any fear, only mockery in his eyes. Her face suddenly felt hot, and she didn't dare meet his gaze any longer. Tim went upstairs. In the public living room on the second floor, there was a custom tuxedo. Gary never tried it on. If he had, he'd realize it wasn't his size. Emily hugged Tim from behind. Tim, go to bed early tonight. We have to get up early tomorrow to send Gary. She couldn't see Tim's face, but when she hugged him today, she didn't feel like letting go. She quickly pushed that feeling aside. She'd already arranged everything perfectly. She'd bring Tim out later. Then, she'd be Tim's savior. He'd surely see her as his only support. Even if she and Gary got married and had a grand wedding, Tim wouldn't escape her grasp. That night, Emily didn't sleep well. She dreamt of that alley again, of escaping an enemy and a boy carrying her on his back. The warmth reverberated through her dream, pulling her awake, sitting up in bed. The phone rang. Her subordinate's voice was urgent. Ms. Miller, we went to Tim's room and couldn't find him. He ran. Damn it, who leaked the info? No. We asked Derry. She said young Master Tim has already left in the Booth's wedding car. Emily stood up abruptly, but before she could go downstairs, her legs were in sudden pain. Though used to injuries, the agony brought her to her knees. When Tim got into the wedding car, the system notified him. His mission shifted, away from Emily, now focusing on Rose. Tim felt an emptiness inside, as if something intangible was being pulled from his chest, forcing him to put a hand over his heart, taking a breath to steady himself. He asked the system curiously after unbinding, will Emily be affected a lot? The system replied without hesitation, absolutely. While her body won't regress to a near-death state thanks to your care, her legs were repaired by the system. Now that she's been booted out, the repairs will disappear. If Emily truly loved him, they got married and had kids just like any regular couple, planning to spend the rest of their lives together. Tim's first wish was for Emily's legs to fully recover. He had been planning it for a while. From the moment the whites pushed him away, he decided to be someone who could truly love and hate. If he found someone he truly loved, he'd be willing to sacrifice anything for them. Who knew he almost took a huge hit because of Emily? Alright, host, we gotta look forward. If I hadn't found Rose as a substitute, your situation might not be any better than Emily's right now. Tim curled his lips into a slight smile. I know I won't dwell on the past. I'm just curious, with Emily becoming a cripple, can she still be Ms. Miller? Meanwhile, Emily was on the floor clutching her legs, rolling in pain. She didn't get why her legs hurt so much. It felt like they were being forcibly broken, and the bone-chilling pain had her breaking out in a cold sweat. But Emily endured it without making a sound, slowly getting through the wave of pain. She hadn't reached her current status by reading and writing or just sitting in an office looking at reports. It was through real fighting and scheming. On the day Gary dumped her because she was poor, she swore she'd make him regret it. This stubbornness carried her through numerous life or death situations. Now victory was in sight. Gary had given his heart to her, bowing down to her other identity's power. Why was something like this happening at such a critical moment? Tim. It had to be Tim messing with her. What exactly happened? Wasn't Tim preparing for their wedding? Why did he end up in the Booth's wedding car? When did he plan all this? She stuck by Tim almost every day and didn't notice anything wrong. The driver Emily had planted in the whites rushed over to her. He helped the woman on the floor. Ms. Miller, are you all right? Should I get a doctor for you? No, it's fine. Emily tried to stand with his help. There's something more important you need to do right now. Send people to the Booths and find out how far the wedding's gone. Oh, and get Daisy, I've got questions for her. But Emily never expected her legs to not listen to her at all. The driver noticed her expression was off and anxiously asked, Ms. Miller, what's wrong? Are your legs numb? Let me help you slowly up. Emily pressed hard on her legs. Her face changed dramatically. She couldn't feel anything. Everything happened so suddenly, she had a bad feeling about it. Despite the cold sweat dripping down her back, she grabbed the driver's collar. Get me to the hospital right now. Tim's wedding car pulled into the Booth's mansion. The huge villa was decorated entirely in white. It looked like a wedding setup, but also a bit like a memorial. When Tim got out, the whole Booth's family was waiting at the door. No one was missing. An elderly lady stood at the front. When she saw Tim, she was about to bow deeply to him. "I'm sorry, child. It was my selfishness that got you into this. I know a joyous occasion might not save Rose, but I couldn't let go of even a shred of hope. Don't worry. If Rose can't make it, we won't let your efforts be in vain. We'll treat you like our own family, like my own grandson. Any request you have, I will fulfill." Tim was stunned and hurried to support the old lady. His eyes turned to Mr. Booth, who was looking at him with affection. The kind of warmth in his eyes was something Tim's real parents never showed him. Tim felt a pang of bitterness. All these years, he put the whites above everything else, fearing abandonment, being cast out. He clung to the little hope the whites gave him. If Gary hadn't shattered his illusions time and again, he'd still be the whites' most loyal dog, willing to do anything for them. But leaving the whites, he walked into what people called a den of demons. Yet here, they tell him he'd have a family. How absurd everything was. Tim looked at the tears in their eyes, feeling unsettled. He turned to Mr. Booth, a bit surprised. "Mr. Booth, didn't you tell Grandma and Mrs. Booth what I told you before?" Mr. Booth took Tim's hand and led him inside. "If Rose really gets through this and you guys develop feelings for real, there's no rush to change how you address us." He then quietly said to Tim, "Tim, I've kept what you said before in mind. I too hope Rose can get better. But we've wished countless times and been disappointed just as many. Now, nobody can handle another letdown. So I couldn't say it. Maybe you do have a way to save Rose." Tim walked into the house. He passed through the garden to reach the secluded villa in the back. He saw a girl lying there, covered in tubes. She couldn't wear her wedding dress, which was set aside in a pristine white. They didn't prepare any marriage certificate or agreement. They knew this wedding was just a last-ditch effort. When Rose finally passed away, they didn't want Tim to become a widower. Tim looked closer. Rose, although pale and frail, was immaculately groomed. He suddenly felt a bit envious. Rose had a family bond and a meaningful life, things he desperately wanted but could never attain. They nodded with red eyes, and finally, a trace of relief showed on their faces. Just as everyone relaxed, a sharp alarm from the machines pierced the air. Rose's heart monitor flatlined. Even though they were prepared, Mr. Booth still took a deep breath and collapsed, caught by Mrs. Booth. The old lady's once unyielding posture now bent with grief. Tim was startled. He mentally urged the system, "Hurry, Rose can't hold on." He had never found the flat, mechanical voice so comforting before. "Don't worry, host. Rose's data has been loaded." The alarm ceased. The heart monitor showed its first blip, and Rose, who had been unconscious for nearly 2 months, opened her eyes. The first person she saw was Tim. Her eyes focused, and Tim saw stars twinkle within them. After Rose woke up, Emily, who'd been sent to the hospital, also regained consciousness. The first person she saw was Gary. The handsome young man pouted, complaining, "What's up with you? Why did you suddenly pass out?" "Oh, I have good news. I'm not marrying that coma patient from the Booths." Emily was still groggy, remembering her intricate plan to have Tim marry Gary instead. She couldn't imagine Gary ever leaving her side. But Gary's next words jolted her awake. "I don't know what Tim's thinking, volunteering like that. Is he nuts? Marrying a dead person?" Emily's temples throbbed painfully. Before she fainted, she'd heard her subordinates say Tim wasn't taken to the Booths by them. How could this happen? In the hospital room with Gary, Daisy snorted and tapped Gary's head. "Do you really think he's that dumb? I had to transfer our 2 houses to him just to get him to agree to the marriage. What more could he want? Besides, becoming in-laws with the Booths, there's nothing bad about that, right? They're big, righteous, and the old lady is quite a figure. He lost his wife right away. Who knows how carefree he is now?" The more Daisy talked, the more reasonable it seemed, and the guilt she felt toward Tim diminished. Since Tim talked to her in the office, she hadn't been eating or sleeping well. She kept seeing Tim's stubborn gaze over and over. It made her reflect. wondering if she'd been too harsh on him. Seems like the little boy grabbing her clothes, calling her sister, hadn't shown up in a long time. Daisy was lost in thought but was pulled back to reality by Emily's voice. Emily, looking shocked, blurted out, "He's with the Booths? What about me?" Daisy felt awkward, scratching her head. "Don't blame me for hiding it. Tim threatened me to keep it secret or else he wouldn't go. I didn't expect he'd be so heartless. Not even telling you. Just pretend he never existed. Anyway, didn't Gary like you? Marrying him still links you to the Whites, right? Tim can't compare to Gary." Emily suppressed her irritation and smiled at the siblings. Deep down, she felt the Whites should be begging her to marry them. She wasn't aiming too high. Yet before she could say anything, Gary interrupted, embarrassed. "Why mention that? Remember, Ms. Miller proposed to me. I can't exactly turn her down." Daisy's expression tightened. "Right, nearly forgot. We need to plan carefully." Emily's discomfort grew. Even though the White siblings didn't want to upset her, and the Ms. Miller they mentioned was her, something felt off. Emily, deep in thought, recalled meeting Tim the first time. Just like now, she had awakened in a room. Tim didn't just ramble on. Instead, he dipped a cotton swab in water and touched her lips. Not like Gary, who wouldn't even bother to pour her a glass of water. And Tim found happiness in simple things. It seemed like he didn't care about what Emily's home was like. Emily had to lie, saying she came from a poor mountain village, had a tough time finding jobs after college, got mugged, and stabbed several times, losing her money. At that moment, Tim's eyes were full of heartache. He believed every word of her far-fetched story. Later, she just needed to speak kindly to Tim when he was upset with Gary, and he'd be all about her again. Emily had met countless men, but even the naive Gary in front of her couldn't compare. Tim was the easiest to please. She decided to get Tim out of the Booths. They needed to have a proper talk. With her plan set, Emily sent the White siblings out of the room. She called in her aide. "What's wrong with my leg? Why can't I feel anything yet? Is this hospital full of quacks? They can't even handle a simple injury? This. The aide stuttered, unable to make things clear. Emily sensed something bad and was staring at him like she wanted to tear him apart. The aide was trembling. In desperation, he finally blurted out the doctor's diagnosis. "Ms. Miller, the doctor says your leg is already necrotic and can't be treated, even if a miracle doctor comes down from the heavens." When Rose woke up, Mr. Booth almost kneeled to Tim, wanting to adopt him on the spot. It was Mrs. Booth who calmed her excited husband. "Tim just married Rose? Wouldn't adopting him now be strange? You should see what the kids think." Right, I'm so muddled." "Tim, you must be tired after today. Let me take you to your room to rest." Tim nodded with a smile. He thought Mr. Booth meant a guest room. But as he walked, he realized Mr. Booth was taking him to the nicest room in the house. Even better than Rose's room. It was cozier. Mr. Booth had Tim sit on the bed. "Tim, I didn't know what you liked, so I had people find out. If there's anything you're not happy with, you need to tell me." Tim gazed around in disbelief. Even the bedside had his favorite gardenia flowers. The shelves were full of books from his field and the novels he enjoyed. Even the bedsheets were his favorite light gray. He thought it was all a coincidence. Not even Daisy, whom he'd known the longest, could say what color he liked or what fruit he loved. "Are these for me?" "Of course, silly kid." Mr. Booth patted his shoulder. "When the old lady said she thought of you as a grandson, she meant it. She never promises what she can't deliver. Honestly, I'm glad it's you who married Rose, and not Gary." Tim was surprised. Why? In his life, it was the first time someone said he was better than Gary. Mentioning Gary, Mr. Booth's smile faded. "Actually, I proposed a marriage to Gary before. When Rose was unhurt, the Whites came to us, hoping to set up their kids. I heard great things about their oldest son, but they introduced us to a good-for-nothing younger son instead. Gary likes clubbing and racing cars, we knew all that, so we declined straight away. But after Rose was hurt, the Whites acted completely different when I reached out again. I don't know how they agreed later on, but I ended up with a bad impression of Gary." Tim lowered his eyes. Gary agreed just to spite Emily. Mr. Booth didn't know this, but Tim had lived through it. Mr. Booth gripped his hand. If Gary had come, I'd only give him money to send him away. I wouldn't prepare these things. Even if you and Rose don't end up in a romantic relationship, I hope you can still call me Dad and Rose your sister. Tim's eyes turned red. He tried to speak but couldn't utter a word. The sound of Dad was too foreign to him. He wished he could call his real father Dad enough for those lost years, but he never got that chance. No rush, Mr. Booth smiled. Fine lines creased at the corners of his eyes. I'll wait for you. I believe in our bond. After seeing Mr. Booth off, Tim lay on the bed. He asked the system what really counts as a successful mission. He used to think it was about falling in love. He and Emily had each other, never to part. But this time he wasn't sure he truly wanted Rose to love him. Plus, he didn't want to tie his feelings to just one woman. Once bitten, twice shy. System response: you need to check her affection level. If Rose's affection for you reaches 100, then you've succeeded in winning her over. I can fulfill your wish then. Aren't you curious about Rose's affection level now? Tim sighed. I don't even know Rose, so how could there be any affection? No, no, no. The system's voice sounded like it was chuckling. Her affection for you is a solid 70. Already way more than when you first met Emily. Tim was a bit surprised. Not just more, it way surpassed it. Even when Emily and he were discussing marriage, the affection level was just at 85. He always thought that was the normal level for a couple who wasn't married yet. The rest would build up over time. While he was lost in thought, the progress bar that belonged to Emily, which had turned gray, started growing slowly. It went up to 90. When Emily learned about her legs being in bad shape, she did have a moment of breakdown. But she's someone who's been through a lot and quickly regained her composure. She coldly asked her family doctor, "What's going on? Even if my legs were going to go bad, it should have happened a year ago. Now all my other injuries are healed. Why are my legs suddenly worse?" The doctor was puzzled too. He could only ask, "Ms. Miller, do you remember who the doctor was that saved you a year ago? Maybe if we ask for their help, there's still a sliver of hope." Emily looked a bit complicated. The person who saved her wasn't a doctor. It was Tim. After spending a year with Tim, she naturally knew Tim didn't know a thing about medicine. He just got bullied a lot at the orphanage and always carried band-aids on him. But it really seemed like being around Tim was why she recovered so fast. Tim always asked her if she loved him. She always expressed her love without hesitation. After all it took was the word love, and the boy was satisfied. Emily shook her head. She was the one who didn't want him first. But now she kept thinking of him, and all the thoughts were good ones. Emily's subordinate remembered something else. "Ms. Miller, you said before you wanted to marry Gary. The wedding is almost ready. But considering your condition, should we delay it a bit?" Emily thought of Gary, and her frown faded. She smiled and said, "It's fine. The wedding will go on, but I need to confess my identity to Gary first." In her wheelchair, disguised bodyguards pushed her out of the hospital. Just inside the White's mansion's door, Emily heard Gary's voice coming from the study. "Give me a break." Emily wondered what trouble the little guy got into this time and was about to open the door to ask. But the next thing she heard pinned her to the spot. "Why did you have to mess with her? Now you find out she's disabled, and you're not happy, huh? Disabled? Is he talking about her?" Gary's whining voice continued. "Sis, you know me. I was just after her body. If the Booths wanted an alliance, I'd dump her in a heartbeat, right? Emily is just a poor girl. What's her status compared to the Whites? Tim's the one who's a fool having a girlfriend like her. Now someone interested in me is Ms. Miller. Marrying into the Millers, our social class will take a huge leap. Isn't that tempting for you?" Daisy sighed. "Since you know she's not good enough for you, why did you have to mess with her? Even though they're both named Miller, their status is worlds apart. Of course, it's to snatch Tim's stuff." Emily looked up sharply. Inside, Daisy seemed stunned, exclaiming, "What do you mean? Snatching Tim's stuff?" Gary was nonchalant. "Why so surprised? I thought you all knew. I made a bet with Tim that if I took his stuff 9 times, he'd cut ties with you all. Emily was the last thing he cared about. You all don't like Tim, right? This way, it won't hurt Mom and Dad's feelings, and Tim won't get any inheritance. Everyone's happy. Daisy's voice sounded strained. So Tim never took your stuff. You've always been taking his. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. She was afraid she'd show her anger. She thought she was using Tim to provoke Gary, make him give in. But actually, it was Gary using her to push Tim away. Among the three of them, the most innocent one was Tim. The bodyguard asked coldly, "Ms. Miller, do you want us to take action?" "No." Emily opened her eyes, her voice as icy as the Arctic. "Not only must they not find out, but you need to keep planning the wedding with Gary. Do you understand?" Emily herself had disappeared. Gary had been quite pleased for a while. Although Daisy's gaze wasn't as doting as it used to be, its complexity was beyond his comprehension. But Gary couldn't be bothered with that right now. To him, the Whites were just a stepping stone. 2 sets of courtyard houses and a mere one. 6 billion barely made the Whites flinch. With family wealth like that, it's hardly impressive among the truly wealthy. Now, he's keen to hold on to Ms. Miller for dear life. He's really aiming for that upgrade in class. Honestly, Gary was a bit scared. Rumor had it Ms. Miller was a cold, ruthless big shot. She was unpredictable. Offending her often meant disappearing within 3 days. The idea of living with someone like that for a lifetime was a mental strain Gary couldn't ignore. But what happened next made all his doubts vanish quickly. Gifts from the Millers started pouring in. Like antique vases, top-notch luxury jewelry, and enough designer bags to fill a closet. Gary hugged these treasures and playfully teased Daisy. But Daisy didn't seem all that happy. "What's up? Why the long face? Yeah, your brother's so overjoyed. Why do you look so down all the time?" The Whites couple rushed back overnight to attend Gary's wedding and were surprised by Daisy's expression. She was once the person who adored Gary the most. What happened to change that? Daisy had swallowed her words more than once. But seeing their reproachful looks now, she couldn't hold it in any longer. "Mom, Dad, do you really not care about Tim at all?" Gary's face changed. The Whites exchanged a knowing glance. "Right? It's been a while since Tim got married. Yet there's no news." "Exactly. Rose said he was critically ill, but the funeral never happened. Who knows what's up? You'd think a son would worry about his parents. We came back and he didn't even ask. It's not like Gary, the loving son we raised." Johnny pulled Gary into an embrace, while Susan peeled fruit nearby. They truly looked like a happy family of 3. Daisy couldn't hold back any longer. "Mom, Dad, things aren't how you think. You know what? Forget it. Too much has happened lately, and I can't explain. But we should visit Tim soon." "Mom, do you remember why I changed my last name?" Susan's face went blank for a moment. Then she remembered. When Tim was taken by the nanny, she cried her heart out, passing out from dehydration several times. After 2 months of fruitless searching, she began to give up hope. Before adopting Gary, she took Daisy to change her last name. She told her daughter that they always had a brother. She should never forget him. The Whites' most beloved child was forever that little boy. But the once heart-wrenching pain slowly faded with Gary's arrival. Susan was momentarily confused. All her affection for Gary, was it really for him, or an imagined son in her mind? But after Tim returned, they didn't grow close. It seemed like everyone forgot the promises made to Tim. Seeing Susan's dazed look, Gary pinched his own thigh hard, tears streaming down his face. He clung to Susan's arm. "Mom, I know you can't let go of my brother. To you, he'll always be irreplaceable. I've never wanted to compete with him. In a few days, I'll be marrying into the Millers. I won't be able to stay with you and Dad anymore. I cherish these last days with you. After my wedding is done, I'll come with you to bring Tim home." Susan was deeply touched, praising Gary for being so good. Yet, Daisy looked on in disbelief. She had seen Gary pinch his thigh just before crying. So all those times he cried before, was it all fake, just like today? And why hadn't anyone thought about it? If Tim's wife really died, how is he even living right now? Without family around, and not knowing anyone from his in-laws. Why has no one truly thought about Tim's situation? Suddenly, Daisy felt a chill creeping from the ground up through her feet. 3 days before the wedding, the Millers sent over a prenuptial agreement. Gary signed his name with a smile. Seeing his attitude, Daisy was annoyed but felt the need to speak up. You didn't even read it before signing? Aren't you worried the Millers might trap you? Gary shrugged it off. I did read it, nothing special. And Ms. Miller already signed. If I make her wait, she might think I'm not willing. Daisy was speechless. A woman they hadn't even met had Gary, her good brother, acting head over heels. She knew exactly what Gary was really interested in. On the wedding day, Gary donned a silk suit. He got into the car the Millers sent. The Whites followed in another car. Once they arrived, they saw someone unexpected. Emily? Gary's shock was impossible to hide. What are you doing here and in a wheelchair? Emily just smiled silently while a bodyguard stood in front of her. Don't you know whose territory you're on? Be respectful to Ms. Miller. Ms. Miller. The Whites were even more surprised. They never imagined the famous Ms. Miller would be so young, almost their daughter-in-law. The grandmother wanted to take Emily's hand. Child, had we known you were Ms. Miller, we'd have given you the head seat at the family banquet. We hope you weren't offended. Emily still didn't speak. Her gaze at the old lady was like looking at garbage. Daisy shook her head in disbelief. No way. If you're Ms. Miller, why would you marry Tim? You embarrassed him for Gary before. Everyone knows that. Gary, what's going on? Daisy turned to ask Gary, but his face was pale. She nudged her brother. Gary's tears fell, even messing up his hair. This can't be. It's impossible. Daisy was confused. Gary dreamed of marrying Ms. Miller. Emily was his ex-girlfriend. He signed the prenuptial agreement, and Emily wasn't going anywhere. Marriage would only make things better for him. Why was Gary sobbing like he'd lost his parents? She tapped his shoulder. What are you doing? Didn't you say you wanted to get married? Why are you crying? Should I tell you why? Emily calmly brushed off her sleeve and instructed, start the wedding. Don't miss the auspicious time. The doors on one side of the hall opened. 2 bodyguards led a tall, overweight woman inside. She looked at least in her 30s but giggled like a 6-year-old. Clearly, she wasn't all there. Emily's smile was devilish. Let me introduce the bride for today, Mary. Gary collapsed to the floor. Can't marry her. I won't marry this person. She's clearly not right. The Whites' parents and grandmother were shocked, shouting how this couldn't happen. They rushed to protect Gary, but Emily had no shortage of bodyguards. They pulled the family aside and dragged Gary to the altar. You can't back out now. You signed the marriage agreement, saw the names. Gary cried, shaking his head. I wanted to marry Ms. Miller. I didn't know her full name. You're deceiving me. Emily, what did I do to deserve this? Didn't you love me the most? Emily enunciated. How could that pauper be good enough for us Whites? Gary, I didn't realize your family was so noble. Since status matters so much, I found someone from the Millers who matches yours. How can you be unhappy with that? Gary was forced to marry this woman, crying and screaming until his voice was hoarse. Daisy, overwhelmed with pity, shouted at Emily. If you have any issues with the Whites, come to me. I'm the Whites' daughter. Let my brother go. Emily's expression was hidden in shadows. It made Daisy randomly think of Tim. On the day Tim agreed to be a substitute groom, Daisy couldn't read his expression either. Maybe all of this was wrong from the start. She softened her voice and pleaded, Emily, I know you're still not over Tim. I regret it now too. Why don't we go to the booths together and openly bring Tim back? Okay? Emily's expression softened a bit. At that moment, someone who'd been tasked to follow the booths rushed in. Ms. Miller, bad news. Rose is awake. They're talking about redoing Rose and Master Tim's wedding. These days, Tim's biggest joy is watching the affection bar in the system. Emily's gray bar is steadily growing. It's about to hit 99. But what does that matter? Tim's target isn't her anymore. Even if Emily loves him to death now, her legs won't heal. As for Rose's pink progress bar, that's something. After Rose woke up, Tim sat by her side, watching over her. In her dazed state, as she looked at Tim's face, her affection surged. It was nearing 90. But as she fully woke up and clearly saw Tim's appearance, her affection dropped back to 70. Tim was worried. System, do you think she has a past love and when her vision is blurred, I look a bit like him to her? Otherwise, why would her affection rise so fast and drop so quickly? The system didn't believe it. Rose's shooting skills are top-notch. No way she has poor vision. Rose felt extremely guilty towards Tim. She bowed her head and apologized. I'm sorry. My grandma and parents were too reckless. They've put you through so much. If you have any requests, just let me know. I'll do my best to fulfill them. Tim paused, his face full of awkwardness. At the booths, he wasn't mistreated. He even gained 5 pounds. Mrs. Booth loved making dishes he enjoyed, and every time Tim looked in the mirror, he thought his face looked rounder. He awkwardly confessed, sorry. I've been living so comfortably at your place. I forgot you woke up. I don't think I have much reason to stay now. Don't get annoyed with me. It's mainly because I promised someone I'd fulfill a condition to save you. Rose looked intrigued. What condition? Not much. Tim's eyes darted around. Just that I need to stick with you for a bit. As soon as he said that, Rose's affection level plummeted. The system screamed in Tim's head. Shut up. She's breaking. Tim fell silent. In the past, when he was with Emily, he never felt such huge fluctuations. Is that the difference between humans and beasts? That night, Rose's affection bar went back up again. Tim hadn't done anything. Seems like she cheered herself up. Still, he was a bit anxious. Rose's affection level kept hovering around 70. Does this mean women don't really like him? Even if the system tries to push them together, would they truly be happy? Although it might save Rose's life, Tim didn't really want to see her as just a conquest. This was a feeling he never had with Emily. He downed 2 bottles of wine, trying to muster up the courage to come clean to Rose. I have something to tell you, he said. Her voice was so flustered it cracked, and her pale face flushed with red. For a moment, you couldn't tell who had actually been drinking. The system was amazed and decided to mute itself. When Tim woke up the next day, he felt pain all over his head, arms, back, everywhere. He called out to the system, what happened? Silence filled the air until the mechanical voice said, see for yourself. Tim's eyes widened. How did this happen? Rose's affection level was maxed out. He rubbed his eyes in disbelief. Was it really that simple, just sleeping on it? And shockingly, Emily's affection level was maxed out too. Why was last night so surreal? Before he could process all this, a pair of hands wrapped around his waist from behind. Tim, you have to take responsibility, said a voice. He never expected things to turn out like this. Tim, in a daze, asked the system. Mrs. Booth always said I was her good luck charm. But really, am I the Booth's lucky star? Was the task really this simple to complete? The system, reflecting in regret, thought, it was my fault. I should have never helped Emily. If I'd paired him with Rose from the start, the task would have been done ages ago. Tim blushed a bit. He didn't expect that he and Rose would be a case of love at first sight. In a further twist, Rose was pregnant. A month and 3 weeks into the pregnancy, it caught the Booths completely off guard. The Booths hurried them to get their marriage license, then picked the nearest date to throw them a wedding. A little later and Rose wouldn't fit into her wedding dress. Tim looked in the mirror, still a bit in disbelief. He asked the system, is the person in the mirror really Tim, not someone else? How could something this good happen to me? Rose, like a little puppy, rubbed her chin against Tim's shoulder. It's you and me, it's really you. Do you think I'm some ancient empress? Why would I need so many lovers? I only love Tim, no matter his last name or first name, it's you. Tim's eyes turned red. Even if he dismissed everything as sweet talk, the system's approval ratings didn't lie. Plus, he trusted Rose's character. And he believed in the Booth's upbringing. He walked over to Rose and pulled her into a hug. Tim, did you see my approval rating? Believe me, I won't ever let it drop. Tim smirked. If it drops, I'm running off with the kid. Your son is my hostage now, Rose. Be smart about it. They both couldn't help but laugh. When Tim went off stage, he spotted some unexpected people. Daisy, how did you know I was getting married? His biological parents, whom he hadn't seen in ages, now seemed somewhat unfamiliar to Tim. Johnny's words got stuck in his throat. He could only awkwardly mumble. Just came to see and, give you a little wedding money. Had they not fallen out with Tim, today they'd be the Booths-in-laws. But now it was too late to regret. Things wouldn't go back to how they were. Susan couldn't help but grasp Tim's hand. Tim, help your brother, plead with Emily. She'll listen to you. Can you ask her to stop tormenting your brother? Please? Tim didn't even have time to respond. Two hands simultaneously intervened, separating the mother and son. Daisy looked pained. Mom, this is not the time to plead for Gary. I've told you he's been bullying Tim all along. Why don't you believe me? Susan looked torn. But he's the one I raised. Rose protected Tim. Whoever's the perpetrator, you deal with them. If there's illegal detention, I'll help report it. And with that, she turned to leave, leaving Susan's sobs behind. Knowing what happened to Gary left Tim uneasy. There was always a sense of doom lingering, until he went out to buy books and was shoved into a car by a group of people. Only then did his nerves settle. He just knew. How could Emily let things go so easily? That woman's specialty was holding grudges. Once at the seaside warehouse, Emily personally took his hand to guide him out. Sorry, Tim. I can't stand upright right now. It's a bit embarrassing. What are you going to do? Your wife is pregnant. A storm brewed in Emily's dark eyes. I wouldn't touch you, but she dared. Tim, how long have you known each other? You definitely haven't thought it through. When you're abroad, I'll help you take care of the child. Tim was taken aback. Are you planning to smuggle? Yeah. Emily laughed. Don't worry, the Millers have connections. They'll make sure you're safe. You're crazy. Yeah, I'm crazy beyond help. Tim, you were the one who saved me. You were the one who got engaged to me. I know I was wrong. I love you, not Gary. Give me another chance. I don't want to lose you. Tim felt everything was absurd. Emily might not be lying. She's liked him so much, but her love was terrifying. He almost laughed out loud. Emily, you think I'm a trash can? Picking up any kind of love? Your love doesn't even deserve a spot compared to others. I gave you countless chances, but you didn't want them. Emily, you're out. Emily's pupils shrank. She pulled Tim into her arms. Just as the word out was spoken, a bullet pierced through the air, straight through Emily's left chest, and into Tim's shoulder. Tim was stunned, didn't even have time to cry out in pain, before someone hugged him tightly. Rose's voice was trembling. Someone, help, save my Tim. Tim knew she was probably too panicked to know what to say. He closed his eyes, silently praying. My first wish is for my family's health and safety. The system asked, what about the second one? Wait, I'll think about it. Tim chuckled. With the system's help, Tim and Rose's baby was born safely in the winter. The Booths didn't throw a huge celebration. The family sat together for a nice meal. Tim never went back to the Whites and didn't contact his biological parents. He just felt a sense of wistfulness. Last winter, he was packing his bags, waiting to be kicked out by Gary. This winter, everything with the Whites was left behind, a part of the past. And Gary finally won his divorce case and split from Mary, but he was so tormented he couldn't have kids anymore. Emily was buried under a nameless stone. No one to brush away the frost and snow. Tim heard a knock on the door. Opening it, he found a toy motorcycle at the doorstep. Daisy talking about adding the bike as a wedding gift seemed like just yesterday. The system softly said, Tim, goodbye. From now on, Tim's life was his to control.